If I were 25 years old again and stepping into the uncertain world of 2026, I wouldn't chase anything exotic or glamorous. I wouldn't run after the newest trick, the loudest guru, or the trend that everyone swears will make you rich overnight. No, Benjamin Graham taught something far more powerful. When the world becomes noisy, wisdom grows in silence. And the story I'm about to tell you is exactly about that silence. The kind that forces you to see what is real, what is inflated, and what you've been pretending not to notice. Before we dive in, I'll warn you. This isn't a tale of quick wins or effortless riches. It's the story of a young man who witnessed how a crowd can lose its mind, and how the world can punish that madness without mercy. It's a story about value. Not just the kind you find in a balance sheet, but the kind you discover inside yourself. In the late 1920s, the United States appeared to be a place where ambition had finally found a balance. Industries were thriving, cities were vibrant, and citizens felt they were living in an era of unprecedented advancement. And in times when people think they are experiencing a remarkable era, they begin to feel exceptional themselves. Conversations revolved around stocks. Taxi drivers, tailors, bakers. Everyone suddenly became an investing whiz. Invest in this stock. My cousin made his money back in a month. If you're not putting your money to work, you're going to miss out. This one is bound to rise. It's our future. The young man in this tale, just in his 20s, absorbed all of this. How could he ignore it? The clamor was inescapable. Every newspaper headline shouted opportunity. Every neighbor bragged about their gains. And every discussion seemed to echo the same sentiment. Only a fool stays out of the game. Graham later penned a line that feels eternal. The investor's greatest challenge, and perhaps his fiercest foe, is himself. At that time, the young man was unaware of this truth. But he was about to find out in a difficult way. The excitement escalated like an illness. People weren't merely purchasing stocks. They were borrowing money to invest even more. Banks were more than willing. Why wouldn't they be? Everyone was profiting. Everyone felt victorious. Or at least, that was their perception. One October day, the market shuddered. Initially, it seemed like a typical downer. A slight jolt, nothing alarming. But soon, the shake transformed into a crack. The crack grew into a roar. And the roar culminated in a collapse so severe, it snatched the joy right off the streets. The young man observed prices plummet faster than he could react. The stocks that everyone assured would never fail crashed to the ground like shattered glass. In just a few hours, arrogance shifted into quiet. Confidence morphed into fear. Aspirations turned into liabilities. It was the type of silence that could make one hear his own pulse. Since everything else had vanished. On that day, thousands faced a harsh reality. It's simple to shine in a growing market. The true challenge is understanding your character when everything collapses. The young man failed to meet that challenge. He lacked wisdom. He was not careful. He did not take a value-oriented approach to investing. He merely followed others. And the market has no pity for those who follow. Weeks afterwards, the young man strolled through the city, where the once lively cafes and trading floors were now occupied by men who appeared to be lost, staring at the ground as if they had lost their spirits. One evening, he sat in solitude, reflecting on all he had lost. The savings he had built over many years, the confidence he thought was unshakable, and the future he believed would be seamless. However, that night brought a shift. For the first time, he didn't focus on prices, or ticker symbols, or the latest news headlines. He turned his attention to himself. Years later, Graham would describe this moment with a saying: "To truly be an investor, you must embrace reality, evaluating facts while disregarding the wishes that skew them." With that, the young man came to an important understanding. He had never truly invested. He had merely hoped. He had wished for the market to improve. He had believed in the correctness of others. He had trusted that fortune would propel him ahead. Hope is an admirable aspect of life, but it can be perilous in the investment world. That evening, he made up his mind. He would no longer let himself be driven by chatter, excitement, or the reckless enthusiasm of the masses. He would start to think, truly think. When things fall apart, many individuals point fingers at everyone but themselves. They hold the market, the economy, bankers, and newspapers accountable. Anything except the person they see in the mirror. Yet, the young man chose a different course. He began to read, to study, to ask questions. He focused on the fundamentals, financial statements, profit reports, core business concepts, the elements that most overlook because they seem boring. But this was exactly what Graham would later explain. Boring means stable. Boring signifies honesty. Boring stands the test of time. The young man uncovered an incredible insight. Most individuals were not investing in businesses. They were betting on narratives. Narratives that were inflated, repeated, and made to seem genuine. However, narratives don't yield dividends. Companies do. Thus, he adopted a new approach. Discover value, not thrills. Pursue truth, not fads. Embrace discipline, not chaos. And gradually, piece by piece, he reconstructed not just his financial situation, but also his integrity. Years later, long after the crash was a thing of the past, after wealth had shifted, after the clamor had subsided, the young man became a sought-after investor for guidance. Not the loudest, not the most extravagant, not the one seeking quick profits, but the one who had grasped the lesson that few want to accept. You don't need to be exceptionally smart to thrive in the market. What you need is patience, skepticism, and emotional control, traits that cannot be taught in an instant. But life will educate you in due course, one misstep at a time. And now, in 2026, if that man found himself at 25 again, starting anew, amidst hype, noise, forecasts, influencers, and illusions, he would remain unfazed. He would recall the crash. He would remember the quiet that followed the noise. He would understand the distinction between a crowd and an individual perspective. And he would softly share a principle Graham lived by. An intelligent investor is a realist who sells to optimists and buys from pessimists. He frequently reflected on that single winter morning, the moment he came to understand that rebuilding his life would hinge not on brilliance, but on honesty. Honesty with himself, honesty about his knowledge and what he lacked. Most he had encountered during the crash were eager to forget the pain of their losses, wishing to believe it was merely a stroke of bad luck. But he played it back deliberately, almost like a movie he refused to turn off. For within that film was the reality he never wanted to lose sight of. He recalled strolling along the streets while the newspapers shouted about catastrophe. Men dressed in long coats lingered outside financial firms, staring at displays that had lost all significance. Values had plummeted so drastically and so quickly that figures seemed false. He observed a man crush a stock certificate in his grip and then let it drop to the ground like refuse. The worth had vanished not just from the document itself. It had disappeared from their gaze, their trust, and their sense of purpose. As fear engulfed the city, something within him became clearer. It wasn't bravery just yet, but it marked the start of his realization. A soft whisper urged him, examine it more closely. Don't follow the crowd. Comprehend what transpired. He discovered that understanding, he soon realized, was the most valuable asset of all. In those months, he dedicated more hours to libraries than any other place. He immersed himself in books until they closed, long past the time when the lights dimmed and the surroundings turned chilly against his skin. Yet he pressed on. For the first instance, he wasn't seeking shortcuts or immediate solutions. He was in search of a framework, something the downfall had mercilessly stripped from his existence. He started to notice connections he had previously overlooked. The market hadn't collapsed out of thin air. The warning signs were everywhere, like fissures in a dam. Increasing debt, overly optimistic news, businesses valued at 10 times their earnings, and individuals mistaking speculation for investment. He came to understand that he had walked directly into the blaze because he had confidence in the masses, believing the crowd surely had insights he lacked. But now he understood the reality. The crowd remains unaware. The crowd merely experiences, and emotions can ruin wealth. He examined businesses like a doctor analyzes the human body. Some were straightforward and transparent, with stable profits and careful leadership. Others resembled fragile fantasies, appealing outwardly but empty inside. He acquired the ability to distinguish between the two. He learned to pose the inquiries that most people overlooked. Is this company genuinely profitable? Who is in charge? Can they endure tough times? Is the cost reasonable, or just an illusion someone crafted? As he delved deeper into his readings, he became increasingly aware of how much of the market was founded on narratives people wished to embrace, rather than facts that could withstand scrutiny. Initially, this realization troubled him, how easily he had been drawn into those tales. But gradually, that discomfort evolved into something more powerful: self-discipline. He no longer focused on grand forecasts or flashy claims. He prioritized resilience. He valued truth. And amid the surrounding chaos, truth appeared to be an incredibly rare gem. Over time, he ceased comparing himself to those around him. He no longer envied the boastful individuals in coffee shops talking about quick gains, because he had witnessed how swiftly such people disappeared when faced with harsh realities. He stopped feeling compelled to keep pace with others or to outshine someone else's achievements. Instead, he learned to evaluate progress in the way Graham would later articulate it: quietly, consistently, and logically. A year went by, then two. The recovery was gradual, excruciatingly gradual, but he was no longer in a hurry. Each investment he made was small yet deliberate, almost doggedly cautious. If a company seemed too well-liked, he took a step back. When a stock price skyrocketed in a manner that many labeled miraculous, he grew wary. And during moments when others panicked, he steadied himself and focused on the facts rather than emotions. People around him began to notice something distinct about him. He wasn't wealthier than his peers. He wasn't striving to impress anyone. However, there was a tranquility about him, an inner steadiness that contrasted the disorder around him. When friends sought his guidance, he didn't make forecasts. He simply conveyed the perspective that had helped him. Focus on the business, not the crowd. Price reflects what you pay. Value reflects what you receive. Don't react, assess. With every choice he made, he felt himself transforming into a different person, not merely a more skilled investor, but a more stable individual. Someone capable of weathering storms. Someone who didn't falter when the world crumbled. In due course, small successes began to emerge. The companies he selected gradually flourished. Dividends came in like steady drips from a faucet. Their profits increased, not in a dramatic surge, but consistently over time. He observed the power of patience, how time, when managed wisely, becomes an ally rather than an adversary. Years later, as he reflected on his past, he came to see that the breakdown he once dreaded had laid the groundwork for all of his learning. Had the market continued to soar, he would have remained in the dark, swept up by the same deceptions that led so many astray. However, because it plummeted, because it fractured, he learned to reconstruct himself in a new way. That transformed version of himself would steer him for the remainder of his days. Now, many years have gone by. Markets have fluctuated numerous times. Fresh innovations emerged, new bubbles burst, and each new generation repeated the same errors in slightly modern attire. Yet he always remembered the inner voice that developed during those formative years, a steady, logical murmur that saved him from becoming the worst version of himself. He envisioned what it would be like to be 25 again today, surrounded by a world brimming with forecasts, influencers, speculation, cryptocurrency crazes, and quick, hot tips. He was self-aware enough to realize that he wouldn't get swept up in the chaos. Not any longer. Once you recognize the distinction between mere noise and true understanding, that insight stays with you forever. He would observe the thrills of 2026 in the same way he viewed the bustling streets of 1929, without fear, but with insight. He would see people pursuing trends like moths to a flame, and he would remain unyielding. He would pause. He would watch. He would pose the same thoughtful questions that he learned to contemplate as a youth. He would invest in the manner Graham encouraged individuals to approach, not with emotion, but through assessment. Not with haste, but with composure. While others attempted to forecast the next big phenomenon, he would examine the neglected, the undervalued, and the unremarkable firms that steadily thrived in the background. There was no requirement for sorcery. There was no urgency for haste. Genuine worth requires patience. Yet true value eventually surfaces. Thus, if he were to advise a young individual today, entering the world with aspirations but lacking guidance, he wouldn't provide them with a checklist of investments or quick solutions. Instead, he would share the one enduring principle, the attitude that helped him remain steadfast through every challenge. Think independently. Tune out the distractions. Pursue truth rather than thrills. And always remember, your biggest asset in this life is not your intellect, but your character. He understood this because he experienced it firsthand, and he had endured the cost of grasping it too late. He frequently recalled the person he once was, the one who thought certainty was real, the one who believed the markets rewarded passion more than discipline. It was like reminiscing about a long-lost acquaintance, someone he used to relate to but had since outgrown. Personal growth has a peculiar way of transforming a person internally without leaving visible scars. Yet the change was evident, unmistakably influencing how he approached each choice. On certain evenings, he would sit by the window of his modest apartment, listening to the soft buzz of the city below, contemplating how much of life resembled the markets. People hurried when they ought to take a step back. They preferred noise over substance. They celebrated triumphs too early or accepted failures too soon. They sought instant results rather than lasting foundations. Nevertheless, the reality was always straightforward. Whatever ascends too quickly also descends rapidly, while whatever develops slowly tends to endure. He discovered this by observing not just figures, but individuals. The most volatile investors he encountered were seldom the least intelligent, they were the least steady. Emotional surges tossed them about, leading them to confuse those surges with rationality. When they made profits, they assumed it was proof of their talent. When they incurred losses, they thought the world had wronged them. Their confidence lacked a solid foundation, making it vulnerable to the slightest disturbance. He vowed never to return to that state. Years went by. Markets fluctuated as they always did, ascending, descending, moving sideways, and sometimes circling back. But he no longer reacted to every shift. If anything, he discovered an unexpected tranquility amidst the unpredictability. Where others perceived threats, he recognized possibilities. Where they saw a reason to flee, he perceived a chance to reflect. He didn't chase peaks, nor did he dread valleys. He simply assessed, calmly and consistently, like someone nurturing a garden rather than playing a game. His investments shifted from being solely about finances to being about insight. Each company he investigated served as a reflection of something meaningful. Some showcased recklessness, promises that far exceeded reality. Others embodied integrity, consistent performance, thoughtful strategies, leadership that considered more than just the next quarter. Over time, his portfolio evolved into an embodiment of his principles: patient, intentional, and anchored. He hadn't achieved wealth by conventional standards just yet. However, he possessed something far more valuable: mastery over his own desires. He understood that this was the real measure of wealth. By managing your feelings, you could influence your choices. And if you could manage your choices, results could eventually reflect logical thinking. On a spring day, long after the financial collapse, he strolled through the familiar part of the city where he had previously witnessed disorder unfold. The landscape had transformed. New structures, fresh enterprises, different faces, but he still sensed the reminders of past events. He could envision younger versions of himself in every swift movement, in every worried expression, in every individual who thought they were chasing good fortune while unknowingly heading towards peril. He halted near the site of what was once a stock office, which had turned into a cafe, buzzing with students typing away on their computers. A boy, filled with enthusiasm, was sharing with his friends about a stock he was convinced would skyrocket soon. They listened intently, just as people had done during the prosperous 20s. It nearly brought a smile to his face, not from superiority, but from understanding. He considered stepping in to provide guidance, to share the hard-won truths he had learned. But he refrained. People seldom grasp insights that come without personal struggle. Each generation has to discover its own truths, to experience its shocks, before recognizing that the basics remain the same. Instead, he wished them well in his thoughts and continued on his way. That evening, he opened a journal he had maintained throughout the years, filled with reflections, errors, successes, and thoughts. The pages were tattered, some edges worn down by time, but it was still his most treasured item. Not because it contained equations or hidden knowledge, but because it documented the journey of a person who learned to think for himself. He composed his thoughts slowly and carefully, as if each phrase warranted its own moment. His writing reflected on how people were now purchasing items they didn't fully grasp, pursuing trends devoid of context, and repeating old habits with modern technology. He wasn't passing judgment. He was merely observing the familiar pattern of human behavior replaying itself. What struck him as extraordinary was not that individuals continued to repeat their errors. It was that timeless principles still held true, just as effectively as they had 100 years ago. Self-discipline remained more effective than zest. Being patient still surpassed making predictions. The truth consistently triumphed over fantasy. That night, he came to another realization. The world was not in need of additional noise. It didn't require more shortcuts or exaggerated assertions or predictions yelled into the void. What was truly necessary was tranquility, depth, and individuals willing to admit, "I don't know, but I will figure it out." He had inadvertently become one of those individuals long ago, despite not aiming for it. Life gradually guided him towards clarity, much like the tide brings a ship into open seas. Now, having traveled through that experience, he felt thankful for each error, every hard lesson, and every doubtful moment. They contributed to the wisdom he possessed now, wisdom so straightforward, it almost seemed antiquated. Yet, he was confident it would last. When envisioning himself as a young man in 2026, surrounded by an overwhelming amount of information, competing voices, and bright screens, he experienced a peculiar sense of tranquility. He understood that the principles he followed would steer him no matter how the world evolved. He didn't need to foresee the future. He only needed to keep his composure when the world lost its way. If he had to start anew today, he would replicate what he did after the downturn. Sit down, analyze the facts, tune out the distractions, and meticulously rebuild from scratch. Not because it was effortless, but because it was the correct choice. Not to gain anyone's admiration, but to safeguard himself from becoming someone who followed the crowd without understanding its direction. And deep down, he recognized a final truth, one that took him a lifetime to comprehend fully. You achieve success in investing not because circumstances improve, but because you learn to be less easily shaken. He occasionally pondered how drastically different his life might have been if he hadn't gone through that crash. If everything had unfolded without a hitch, if the markets had kept rising, if he had never been compelled to face his own misconceptions. Yet, whenever this notion entered his mind, it quickly faded away. Without that collapse, he would have remained unwise, swayed by the same forces that led so many to downfall. Without the hardship, there would have been no metamorphosis. He understood now that growth seldom occurs in comfort. There were instances, particularly as he grew older, when young traders would come to him. Some arrived with enthusiasm, holding charts and forecasts, eager to show off their belief in the market. Others came feeling anxious, troubled by their losses, and searching for reassurance to quiet their worries. Listening to them reminded him of his own past experiences at various stages of his life. He never criticized them. He merely listened intently, knowing what it felt like to be on the brink of doubt. When they sought his advice, he didn't bombard them with complex ideas or alarming cautions. He spoke gently, selecting each word carefully, as if giving them something delicate. Many of them anticipated revolutionary insights or a hidden trick. Instead, he shared the most straightforward lesson he had come to know. You don't have to foresee anything. You merely need to grasp what you are observing. Some individuals were let down by the straightforwardness of his response. Others walked away feeling he was overly careful. However, those few who genuinely listened gained a rare gift, understanding. He had recognized long ago that having clarity was far more precious than being confident. He recognized himself in those select few. They shared his thirst for insight. They wanted to look deeper than what was visible. These were the individuals he chose to mentor. He taught them to analyze businesses like narratives, to uncover truths obscured by excitement, and to differentiate substance from trivial chatter. They didn't attain wealth immediately. None of them did. But they became stable, and that was worth so much more. One night, after an extensive discussion with a particularly enthusiastic student, he went outside and felt the cool breeze on his face. The distant city lights emitted a gentle glow, and for a fleeting moment, he sensed the weight of time. How many years had elapsed? How many cycles had repeated themselves? And how many errors he had seen occur repeatedly. Yet inside that repetition lay something beautiful. It proved that principles held significance. The world shifted, technology progressed, markets grew more intricate, yet human behavior fundamentally stayed the same. Fear and greed remained unchanged. Shortcuts were always present. Illusions never ceased to reappear. And because those aspects remained constant, the lessons he had learned retained their importance. He meandered through the silent streets, reflecting on the younger generation entering a realm of bright opportunities and perilous pitfalls. He wished to shield them from every error, guide them through every illusion, and teach them to think clearly before the harsh realities of the world set in. But he understood that wasn't feasible. Wisdom couldn't simply be given, it had to be earned. Still, he could impart his knowledge. He could at least illuminate their way so they didn't have to navigate entirely in darkness. So he continued writing. He continued teaching. He kept reminding anyone willing to listen that the world rewarded persistence rather than haste. He recalled one particular night when he had been engulfed by uncertainty long before gaining any real insight. He remembered walking back and forth in his small room, gazing at a portfolio that seemed to dissolve before him, questioning whether he was too naive to attempt again. That memory felt haunting, a quiet reminder of who he might have become if he had chosen to give up. But he didn't give up. He learned, and that learning rescued him. With each decade, his confidence evolved. It no longer relied on market fluctuations. It no longer hinged on public perception or trends. It stemmed from something within, an anchor he had constructed gradually. He had transformed into a man capable of witnessing the world stumble over the same mistakes without faltering. He came to understand something else, something more profound. The greatest asset a person could possess wasn't a business, real estate, or investments. It was a mindset resilient enough to face unpredictability, a serene mind, a patient heart, a logical perspective when the surrounding chaos suggested otherwise. He had nurtured that mindset over time, much like a gardener caring for a tranquil patch of ground, and it proved to be much more reliable than any financial venture he had ever undertaken. As time gracefully passed, he began to embrace a tranquil simplicity. His existence wasn't lavish, but it was stable. He enjoyed the freedom to awaken without dread, to make choices without stress, to rest without remorse. This freedom was the reward for years of intentional reflection. He often chuckled at the irony. In his youth, he believed that wealth was the goal. Yet eventually, he recognized that wealth was simply a result of thinking wisely. And thinking wisely represented the true journey. One morning, as he sat at his kitchen table, sunlight gently streaming through the drapes, he pondered all that he had gone through. If a young person were seated across from him at that moment, someone filled with doubt, ambition, and restlessness, he knew precisely what he would say to them. He would explain that the market doesn't value intelligence. It doesn't bother with their level of certainty. It solely rewards those who can stay composed when others are losing their grip. He would caution them that the chase for wealth should never compromise their clarity, and that the world will continuously entice them with quick fixes leading nowhere. He would remind them of one vital truth, possibly the most crucial of all. You need to learn to rely on your own judgment more than the crowd's excitement. He reclined in his chair, the stillness enveloping the room, filled with the tranquility acquired over decades of experiences. Life had challenged him, taught him humility, molded him, and ultimately provided him with the only reward that truly mattered: insight. As he shut his eyes, embracing the morning's warmth, he reflected that if he had to begin anew, young, unsure, amidst chaos, he would select the same journey. The gradual one, the sensible one, the one founded on principles, not thrills. For that journey, though serene, always directed him precisely where he needed to go. He observed people pursue trends like gamblers looking for a winning streak, always certain that the next turn of fate would erase previous losses. Gavin understood differently. His life experiences taught him that the market does not favor excitement. It values discipline, patience, and remaining composed when everyone else panics, as if disaster looms. However, as time progressed, something unforeseen occurred. The very students who had previously dismissed his advice returned. Older, more modest, bearing the burden of mistakes they could no longer ignore. They posed similar questions, but in various ways. How can I stop my losses? How do I invest fearlessly? How do I start from scratch? And Gavin consistently offered the same response. even though many were reluctant to accept it. By taking your time, he didn't imply being inactive or apathetic. He meant mastering the ability to think clearly before taking action, evaluating a company prior to investing in its stock, and distinguishing fleeting distractions from lasting truths. It was straightforward guidance, almost too simple for a society obsessed with quick fixes. Yet it proved effective, without fail. One chilly evening in late autumn, a former student named Laura came to see him. She had risen to being a well-paid executive, but had managed to lose nearly everything due to reckless trading during a chaotic market period. She appeared drained, like someone who hadn't rested in days. "I followed all the wrong influencers," she confessed. "Every online voice seemed so sure, confident, and bold. And I trusted them." Gavin refrained from passing judgment. He had witnessed this narrative unfold countless times, and the outcome no longer caught him off guard. "What do you wish to do now?" he inquired. She paused. "Start fresh, but not as the person I used to be." Gavin nodded thoughtfully. "That's good. Then we start as I do with anyone who believes they've lost too much, by recognizing that you haven't lost anything truly significant. Money fades. Skills endure. Wisdom expands." She settled back in her chair, allowing his words to resonate within her. He retrieved a slender notebook, the type he always kept on hand, and placed it before her. Inside were basic handwritten guidelines, 10 in total. No complex terminology, no intricate formulas. Just principles that had led him from poverty to stability, from confusion to clarity. Laura browsed through the pages, reading quietly. After a brief pause, she remarked, This seems overly straightforward." "It's straightforward because the market itself is straightforward," Gavin responded. "People complicate it to sell you something." She shut the notebook and gazed at him with an odd blend of relief and skepticism. "So by following these, I can restore everything?" "You'll achieve more than just restoration," he replied. "You'll finally stop allowing the market to dictate your feelings." A slight smile emerged on her face, the kind that springs from the initial glimmer of hope after a long struggle. Gavin recognized it immediately. It reminded him of the expression he had had years ago when he first learned the principles that influenced his own life. For a brief moment, the room was still. The fire popped, the atmosphere calmed, and time felt as if it were moving more deliberately. Then Gavin adjusted his glasses and said gently, "There's one final point. You must vow never to follow the crowd again. Crowds are noisy, hasty, and often mistaken. Your task is to remain logical when others lose their way." She agreed without a moment's hesitation. "I promise." And within that small commitment, Gavin recognized the start of a fresh narrative, one he had seen many times before, yet every iteration felt unique because each individual who opted for discipline over disorder transformed a small part of the world. "Great," he replied. "So we'll begin tomorrow." The following morning, Laura came in earlier than anticipated, exuding a quiet resolve that was missing the night before. Gavin noticed it right away. Those who were truly prepared for change always carried themselves differently, more deliberately, more steadily, as though they had finally grasped the price of rushing. He invited her in, poured them both a couple of cups of coffee, and set a pile of old annual reports on the table. "These," he said, lightly tapping the papers, "are where clarity starts." Laura grimaced. "I thought we were focusing on stock purchases." "We are," Gavin affirmed. "However, we need to learn how to analyze a business first. You can't evaluate a person based on a single conversation, just as you can't assess a company from one news headline." She sighed, nodded, and began to read the first report. Initially, it all appeared confusing: figures, margins, percentages. But as they went over it meticulously, She started to see trends, indications of growth, signs of vulnerabilities, hints that were hidden in plain view. Gavin didn't lecture. He simply facilitated the process, like a lighthouse providing guidance without forcing a ship to follow. After a couple of hours, Laura leaned back and stretched. "It's odd," she remarked. "This feels soothing. The more I comprehend, the less anxious I become." "That's exactly it," Gavin said. "Knowledge doesn't eliminate risk. It eliminates fear." They followed the same routine for several days. Mornings spent reviewing reports, afternoons focused on company discussions, and evenings dedicated to analyzing notes. She learned to identify strong businesses, to dodge enticing pitfalls, and to assess pricing not as an emotional reaction, but as a straightforward number relative to value. One afternoon, following an extensive session, Laura inquired, "Why isn't this taught more? Why has no one ever shared that investing should feel dull?" Gavin chuckled quietly. "Because dullness doesn't sell. Excitement does. Yet dullness," he added, "is where wealth develops." Weeks flew by. Her self-assurance returned, not the kind driven by recklessness, but the calm, steady kind that emerges through skill rather than chance. She ceased obsessively monitoring stock prices. She stopped reacting to every market news item. Instead, she began to engage with the market like a veteran sailor facing the ocean, with respect, awareness, and patience. Then one day, after she concluded her analysis of a company's decade-long data, she shut her notebook and stated, "I believe I'm ready to create my portfolio." Gavin examined her expression. She wasn't excited. She was ready. That made all the difference. "Show me the companies you've selected," he requested. She handed him the list. He scrutinized each name closely. Her choices weren't eye-catching or trendy, but they were sensible, reliable businesses with steady earnings, disciplined management, and reasonable valuations. When he was done, he set the list down on the table and smiled. "You've picked things up nicely. This investment plan won't make you wealthy right away, but it will pave the way for your future." For the first time in several months, Laura experienced a feeling she had missed for a long while: security. Not thrill, not rush, just security, an anchor solid enough to rely on. She shut her notebook and spoke, a bit bashfully, "I wish I had known this sooner." Gavin responded by shaking his head. "Nobody learns until they are prepared. You showed up at just the right moment, not too early." They sat quietly for a moment, allowing the significance of that statement to sink in. Then Gavin continued, his tone softer than before. "Keep this in mind, Laura. Investing isn't about outdoing others. It's about maintaining your own clarity amid the chaos." She nodded in response. "I finally get it." As she prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Thank you," she said, not out of obligation, but from a place of genuine transformation. Gavin watched her walk away down the quiet street, steady, composed, carrying her new knowledge like a shield against the chaos she once feared. He knew she would be fine. More than fine. She would thrive, because she had learned the lesson most never learn, that true wealth begins not with money, but with clarity. And as the evening sun settled across the old study, Gavin returned to his chair, opened his worn notebook, and wrote a single line at the bottom of a fresh page. Another mind rescued from the noise. The story could end there, but in truth, it didn't. Because every person who learns to think clearly about money ends up teaching someone else. And in that quiet chain of understanding, the world becomes just a little wiser.